Justin and I have been in communication since the weekend. And on the weekend, one of the things we discussed was having kind of transparency in the process and having an open dialogue. And so this is really just a continuation of that process. So hi, Justin.
Hey, John. Good to be here. And our conversations go back. We had some good conversations in Madrid earlier in the year, which were nice for when we were in town for the Open. And then it was good to see you on site, before all this other stuff started happening that we'll talk about today. But it was great having that conversation and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and one of the things I know, obviously the last week there's been kind of lots to talk about semi-finals. I think with Europe in particular, in regards to the lane discrepancies and the air assault runner. I think one of the things in kind of framing the conversation is that one of the things that we're very appreciative of is the time that you guys took on site, the transparency in the process. As you know, everyone kind of involved in the process was there for hours. And one of the things we want to do is create a way forward of working together and making things better. And that's really important from kind of our side in this process, especially with like so many videos, so many ideas going out there at the moment.
Yep. And I think this was one of the subjects that you and I spent a lot of time talking about before and during this is, really I see this as we're on the same side. We want the best outcome. We want our sport to grow. I work for CrossFit, and our number one job with the sport group is to use sport to introduce CrossFit to new audiences, have them interested in the notion of CrossFit and hopefully try a workout themselves and eventually find themselves into a coach and into an affiliated gym. Like that's the whole goal. At the same time, we also want to run a safe, fair competition for athletes across the board with multiple different stages. And we want to do that to the highest possible standard that we're capable of. So in that, I think we want the exact same things that the athletes want, less subjectivity. I think transparency, we welcome. This is hopefully a step in that process.
And so I think this is one of the things that kind of starts to lead us onto what happened on the events kind of Saturday night and leading on to Sunday. And I think one of the things that I would typically hear from people, and this is one of the discussions we had, is regarding the appeals process, how it's hard for athletes who kind of get no reps on the competition floor, but then there's kind of seemingly no recourse for them because they're not able to appeal that process. So we were kind of discussing how, I suppose, different ways that process could be improved.
Yep. Yeah, we did. And I think in some cases, there's a lot of things that athletes do have the ability to dispute or appeal. Our goal is when there are very clear things that the athlete feels like were either miscounted or misaligned or there was judge interference, we want to be able to make sure that there's a ability for the athlete to present those and for those to be met. So yeah, that's the goal. I think there's also a practical nature of this as well, which is you're trying to run a lot of competition in a short period of time. And so you have to balance that. I think one of the things we implemented this year with the kind of 2-strike rule, athletes had a limited number of appeals. And so they had to be careful about what they appealed to make sure that it was appropriate. And I think that was, hopefully, universally well received, but yeah.
Yeah, I think this is one of the kind of things regarding the transparency. And one of the big discussions that we had in kind of what's appealable, what's not appealable, and one of the understandings that we kind of had from the rule book is that kind of no reps on the competition floor, those kind of things weren't appealable. Kind of when we look retrospectively at that as well, we also see that like some people were awarded in the end no reps for judges' calls on the competition floor. And I think still within the community, there's not necessarily, or kind of the sports community, an understanding of to why those occurred, or why those discrepancies occurred, that some athletes were able to appeal and other athletes weren't able to appeal.
Do you have a specific case that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so we kind of know from the rule book that like kind of a judge's call is final. And so a lot of the coaches and athletes have an understanding of that, okay, it's a no rep, the judge's call, that judgment call has been made. And you never really know what's kind of going on behind the scenes. And there is an example from Test 6, which came out this weekend from Europe, where an athlete was on the floor. She was awarded a no rep by the judge. However, it then took her a bit of time to do the rep again. She was, in essence, appealed that. and was given back the time for the no rep. Kind of a specific case where a no rep's been appealed, which shouldn't be able to be done, but it's kind of been granted, which left some of kind of the coaches and athletes questioning as to why that may happen.
Got it. And which event are you talking about?
This was event 6 in Europe. It was one of the overhead squats on the floor.
Got it. I'm not particularly close to that, so I don't know what the answer is or what the specific case around that was. Sorry.
That's no worries, but I think this is kind of one of the building on to what happened regarding kind of event 4 and event 5 the competition, and started the discussion between us. I mean, I think that people have background. I don't know if you want me to touch base on a little bit of the background or an overview so people have an idea.
Sure, they'd be happy to.
Yeah, so in essence, what happened on Saturday, the event was running. I kind of became aware that some of the notably good runners, particularly in the male heat, which happened with all the females, were getting off the runner kind of last or close to last. And there was kind of a consistent pattern that was happening in one particular lane, lane 8 as it's become known. Not only that, when the athletes kind of came back in, a lot of them were saying the runner might feel sticky. Might have brought up kind of appeals after the event, just saying something felt off with the runner, felt very strange. And what we started to notice was there was a pattern, in essence, with everyone in the same lane. So what we then decided to do was kind of just group everyone together, all 11 athletes from that lane, and put in an appeal, understanding that we felt there was something not functioning with the piece of equipment, and therefore we could appeal that and kind of take that to the team. So we took it to the team, and what was discussed is that, you know, that the team didn't necessarily feel that there was any difference in the runner, that they'd been calibrated before with the method that you guys used to calibrate the air assault runners. And that after some more discussion, if we could find a way of calibrating before the start of the next competition day, then we could possibly find a resolution to this problem. One of the big issues, it was Saturday night in Berlin. We tried, but we had no way of being able to find a device that could calibrate the runners. So what we ended up doing was putting a set of data together. And one of the good things about the event is there were so many athletes kind of divided between these 10 lanes. We actually had quite a lot of data, and we could start to, actually start to build some empirical evidence that lane 8 was indeed slower. And that was then presented before the next competition day on Sunday.
Yeah, so I guess the timeline, so for your listeners to kind of understand what's happening, earlier that day, you and I had coffee. We'd have a long conversation about different topics. There wasn't an appeal in process. We came back. I think it was either you or Snorri had informed me, hey, you want to have a conversation. There's an issue taking place. So we had a conversation. The understanding was that there was athletes that were appealing that there was a malfunctioning piece of equipment in lane 8. And so we left that, and you asked if I was informed of that. I was not informed of that. That had been an appeal that I wasn't aware of. So went back, checked with the team, came back to ensure to you guys that this was being looked into. I think you were in the process of saying, hey, you wanted to get additional papers so that all the athletes had the same opportunity to appeal. We let you know that, hey, if there's an issue with a piece of equipment not in a lane, and it is in fact a malfunctioning piece of equipment, it's not an appeals paperwork thing. It's not like, hey, if some athlete didn't file their paperwork, then they would not be also included in the process. So the process that we went through after that was the team was already in the middle of this, but we went back and we reviewed the actual runners that were being used in competition. And so the allegation was the heat results for lane 8 were higher, meaning that they were less favorable for the athlete than some of the other lanes, and that there was an outlier. So the first thing that we did is we went back and we looked at the machines themselves. There's a couple different ways that we were looking at kind of like, is it wired correctly? Is the monitor performing correctly? Additional things that the team were doing is there's like a kick test. So like with one swipe on the rower, as you know, there's a small white piece of tape. You measure the amount of revolutions that go through with the simple one. There's an additional step that the team went through, which was to run a fixed distance at a fixed pace. and then exit the runner, and then see how long it took for the machine to decelerate to a stop, and then also the total distance covered running at a fixed distance at a fixed pace. So the data that they had pulled back was that, hey, the runners were within an ordinary range. So lane 8 was actually not an outlier. There were other devices that were similar to that. And then also there were certain runners that were even a little bit faster than that one was. So we came back and I shared that with you. After that, Boz came back and asked, I believe, what was the outcome that would make the athletes feel comfortable that we had done our due diligence? Because we had at first said, one of these machines is not an outlier relative to the remainder of the field. And the request was, hey, is there some type of a device that we can produce? Is there something that exists that would allow us to not use kind of human error in the calculation of this, people running, exiting the runner at a certain time, and then measuring that? But is there something that would just be like a machine that could do this for us? And that was the subject of conversation overnight. What our team additionally did, based on what you had, is you were working on the heat results for those different lanes. And you had found that lane 8 had poorer heat results. We looked at a couple other things to help kind of narrow that down. When athletes were finished with the barbell work and when they got to the runner, and whether there was a difference between that lane and others. The other thing that our team did, and like you said, they stayed late trying to do a little additional research, or as much as we could. We also went back and reviewed the performance of lane 8 relative to a few other runners on event number 1. And so event number 1 was also one that they were used. The same device would have been in lane 8 because we numbered the 1 through 20. And so 1 through 10 were used for the events that you were talking about. But we went back, and because we have that through our kind of video replay cameras that we use for managing appeals, we went back and reviewed that data too. And after just looking at, I don't remember how many it was, but a small number, lane 8 was not actually the slowest run times of the few lanes that we looked at. So at that point, we felt like we had enough kind of anecdotal, and also like through the video review process, we had enough data to say, hey, lane 8 was not a malfunctioning piece of equipment. There was not a monitor issue. It wasn't like there was a wire unplugged or something. We had high confidence that it was in kind of an ordinary variance. And then we carried on the conversation from there. And I think the conversation that we went into, you and I did, was, well, hey, what is that numerically? Like, what is the difference between one lane and another lane that would be acceptable? And what we came to was, hey, there is no, like, we don't have hey, there's a certain drag factor, or there's a certain number of revolutions that would be an objective criteria. The request from you guys was, hey, we feel like the results from lane 8 were obviously outliers because of the equipment, but that also doesn't take into account the athlete's performance. So when you're saying lane 8 was slower, what we're actually saying is the athletes who ran in lane 8 ran slower. And that could be because of the device. That could also be because of the performance of the individual athletes there.
Yeah, so I just love to jump in with a few points there, Justin. I think one thing that everyone kind of came to agreement was the calibration used for the air assault runner was maybe not the most robust method. There were lots of errors in the way someone could run, the way someone could step on, and that led to a lot of uncertainty amongst ourselves as coaches, and I believe amongst the team, that in essence running on the air assault runner, counting the revolutions after, just really isn't a good way to calibrate the machine. And therefore that kind of leaves lots of holes in this. The fact that someone ran on, sorry, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in also. I think the method that we used was the exact same method that you used to provide your data, which was running on the machine. There's a variance between the athletes, right?
So one of the big things with this, Justin, the difference between the data is our data set. We've had various data scientists look at this. We've done like very thorough statistical analysis, and the probability that lane 8 was just an outlier is less than 1%, and that's like statistically significant. And the one other thing that we found is there's lots of plausibility data. You might want to take into account people who've been running on that lane, say it was an outlier lane. One of the arguments that was used is that typically in these heats, the middle lanes tend to be quicker than the outer lanes. However, what we found was that lane 7 was actually the quickest lane, and lane 8 was then the slowest lane. And just to give you an idea, even in this data set, we're kind of using around 120 athletes. Some had pulled out, so they're slightly less. But the difference between lane 7 and lane number 8 was 20 seconds. So this is where the issues start to arise, is that we're now looking at this data. We're understanding that the probability that this is just a random chance is less than 1%. We have strong evidence to back that up. We also have lots of plausibility data. We have that from the male athletes and the female athletes. We also have that from athletes that have done the events together, yet had like wildly different times. And we're starting to build up a really solid base of evidence. What then started to happen in future weeks, and this is retrospective, but all this data that I've just mentioned was kind of handed before 7 o'clock. What then started to happen was that actually, we started to find other discrepancies in the runners from other regions that actually athletes had also brought up. So we're building this kind of big picture of evidence that there is something wrong with the air assault runner in terms of, and when I say wrong, the definition of wrong being that some runners are faster, some runners are slower. And what that's led to is some athletes getting an advantage and some athletes having a disadvantage. And ultimately, that has led to qualifications to the games. Now, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this, have all this data done before, what the reason we worked through the night is because the one thing I didn't want to happen was it to be spoken about kind of affecting the results at the end of the day. Because one thing that's important to remember, this is all still in live competition. No one's got their game spot yet. And so the one thing that was proposed is that actually we can use, we've got the data here. It's become very clear. How can we use this in order to find a resolution at this moment in time? So the difference in speed, which is now agreeable, there was a difference in speed between assault runners, doesn't actually impact the athletes that are qualifying for the CrossFit Games.
Yeah, and this is where I think it really broke down on site in our conversation. Was you provided a small sample set of data and said that was enough to warrant making a decision to award seconds back to athletes in lane 8. And by that same token, you acknowledge that certain others, it looks like we're faster in that case. So in essence, what we're saying there is that if we were going to take seconds, if we're going to give seconds away, so take seconds away. So let's say that lane 8 was an outlier event and all of the others were normal, but lane 8 was a whole lot slower. Lane 8 was the runners who ran in lane 8 were a little bit slower on average than the runners that ran in lane 10. And lane 10 was a little bit slower on average than what was the other one? 6. And lane 4 was statistically had the fastest run results. Lane 5 had the second fastest run results, and lane 7 had the third fastest run results. So in essence, what you were appealing for is that only the athletes in lane 8 would have a score adjustment, and that it would be based on the math that you guys had provided. What we said is there's no way for us to objectively say, hey, what is the difference between the runners in one lane and the runners in another based on the machines themselves? And so what we looked at is we said, hey, these all fell within an ordinary range. I think we can do a better job quantifying what that is in the future and also working with the manufacturers on whatever the device is. But your request that we only apply an adjustment to the athletes in lane 8 and not apply some type of similar adjustment to athletes in other lanes was the one that we said is not a feasible thing. One, because we don't have a standardized way to say if it was above or below. And then the second being that we don't know for a fact that this is outside of any other kind of variance that we would see in any other competition.
So just to jump in, one of the big things is that this data set is very strong. And so the data that we have, it is strong. And I think one of the frustrations became is that the standard variation between things of a 20-second variation on an 800-meter run between two runners, it is, as you understand, so the average finish time in the heat or average finish placement in the heat of lane 7 compared to lane 8 was top 3 compared to bottom 3. And that would easily correlate with this 20-second time difference. And I think that's one of the hard things that's frustrating is that I don't believe, as I think everyone knows, if this argument was like, oh, the barbell was loaded wrong, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We'd be like, okay, the barbell was loaded wrong. why don't we review this and have a look? What we're kind of saying, what we are saying is that there was a time difference between the runners, and in order to create fairness in this event, that something needed to be done, because otherwise what's happened is really it's become an unfair test that has awarded points in essence based on luck in terms of which lane you were allocated.
See, and this is the part, I guess we disagree on that. What you're saying is that your argument is that the device itself was the single determining factor and the athletes were not. And so you're saying that there's no chance that the athletes that ran in lane 7 or lane 4.
There is a chance, but that chance is minimal. So this is what the data provided, is that actually this of it being chance and just randomness is minimal. And then when you start to add that to the plausibility data that we found in terms of having, data from World Athletics of the track times, data from previous competitions on the runner, it starts to build a bigger picture. And that also doesn't take into account some of the findings from other regions, which have actually come back with similar data after lots of people reached out regarding this, offering to kind of look and do similar studies of the regions. And actually the data is now being driven across other regions. And because there's such a large pool of athletes, it's very, it's very strong evidence.
Yeah. And I guess here's the point that we reached on site is we don't have an objective way to determine if the machines were or were not faster. What we saw was based on what we saw that it was within an ordinary range. And in fact, by our evidence and what we saw, lane 8 was actually not the slowest device of the ones that we had tested. We went back and we looked at the run times for event number 1, and the run times for athletes in lane 8 were not the slowest average run times of the other lanes that we had looked at. And so there was a assumption that you guys made that, hey, this is absolutely the device. And we said, hey, there's other variables that should be taken into account, including the athletes, their performance themselves as well. What we agreed to on site was I think it would be better for us to have an objective set of saying in advance of the competition, how can we give the athletes and our judges and our teams the same amount of trust to say, hey, there is no malfunction in this. How do we test these? How do we quality control these to make sure that they are in an acceptable range to be used inside the competition? And like when we go to the CrossFit Games and other places, the ideal is to be able to run outside. And so even when you run outside in any competition, there's going to be certain athletes that have, the favorability of one lane versus another based on where they set up. So I do think that there's some opportunity for us to keep going on this. What we did not have the opportunity to do is to take your data and only apply an adjustment to the athletes in one lane. And if we were going to do that, that would be unfavorable to the athletes in all of the other lanes. So I think finding a good way that we can make sure that we've got the right equipment, making sure that there are no malfunctions so the athletes don't have to have this type of conversation interfere with their competition experience is absolutely what we all want. But also how we would arrive at an adjustment, taking into account that all of the athletes run differently. So you can't just say, for instance, we will take the run times of those athletes and we will just, based on some logic that we created overnight, give them the benefit of whatever it was, call it some amount of seconds. We would only be able to do that if we also gave all the other athletes in the competition the exact same opportunity for an adjustment, which, by the way, I don't think we have any evidence now would be a warranted outcome from this situation. So,
there's one thing
we're going to have to cut this off soon. I want to just say we had discussed this in advance. I had a specific window, so I'm not trying to cut the conversation off. We are a little bit time bound here.
No, okay, and I think from our side, to summarize it, it's very hard to, I think for the athletes who were in that lane, it's very hard to accept that they would take a disadvantage because actually it becomes about the whole of all the athletes, and that was one of the reasons I think that a lot of people reached out. A lot of people felt that way regarding the event and the runners. That there is one thing that I'm in complete agreement with you, and I think that the people I've spoken to is that the future is very important. Like, everyone has a lot of love for the sport and wants to see it grow, and hopefully that can be done together, and hopefully these situations can be minimized in the future so these outcomes kind of don't happen again.
Yeah, and I think kind of our parting thoughts were, there was kind of three main thrusts of the argument that you had made. One is that there was a malfunctioning device that was an outlier. Based on what we saw with our team, it was not an outlier of a device. The second thing was that you guys had provided objective proof and that CrossFit didn't act on that. I think what's important for people to understand is we took that, we did additional work to try to create as much objective and empirical, like we looked at the results from event number 1. And the hypothesis would have been that if the average run times on lane 8 were affected by, in the, event number 5, that same theory would say, hey, then the average runtime for lane 8 and event 1 should have been higher than average. And by doing just a few lanes, it was not even the slowest in terms of average runtime for lane number 1. The third is that we didn't consider this when we made the decision not to act. Our decision not to act was we don't have an objective way to give the benefit of a certain number of seconds or to penalize athletes who may have had a faster one in this instance. So I think where that leaves us is in terms of transparency, we had a lot of conversation on this. We tried to work very closely with the athletes and the coaches who were involved with this to try to, one, confidently determine, was one of these devices, did it malfunction? Was it put together wrong? Or is it wired incorrectly? Was it not performing the way all of the other devices were performing in terms of reading? And the truth is it was performing the same way that the other devices were. Whether that piece of equipment deserves to be in competition in the future, fair subject for conversation. If we were going to award something, do we have the right criteria to either penalize or reward athletes after the fact? That is a decision that has to be made with a ton of scrutiny. And it was not something that we were going to do over that night, especially when we determined that the equipment was not malfunctioning. So I think the key thing here is there's a lot of dialogue here. It started before the competition. It was through the appeal into in the following day. We did that with the athletes, with the coaches, with you guys. We tried to find some reasonable solution that would give the athletes confidence in the process. We've shared with you guys kind of what we did. Can it be better in the future? I hope so. And I hope that hopefully the lines of dialogue stay open and athletes and, coaches have a better kind of view in the process. But the notion that CrossFit did not review the evidence, didn't work in good faith to try to come up with a reasonable solution, that's not accurate. I think we worked very hard to make sure that we were, one, addressing the issue, which is there a malfunctioning piece of equipment? It was not. And then second, I think there will be ongoing conversation about what's the best way to handle these type of circumstances in the future.
Yeah, I think people look forward to this ongoing transparency and in essence, opening up this process is kind of beforehand so we can minimize these instances happening.
Yeah, and in our case, we're not just looking for athletes in one lane. We want what's best for all the athletes. I know you had athletes that were competing in that lane, so you were affected by this.
I also had competitors of athletes. So, this is the one thing that we wanted to try and minimize is the reason for this is for the whole, is that actually, the reason that we're doing this is for the whole of the sport, because we didn't want unfair biases on the floor, which have kind of set the precedent of our conversations. It's not about favoring one athlete. It's actually about making fairness across the board. And that is one thing we really wanted to achieve with this.
Yeah, we want the exact same thing. We want fairness across the board, and we want to continue to raise the bar. So, hey, John, thanks for the time.
Of course.
And we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks, man.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.